At a certain stage of the Second World War, military brilliance stopped being enough. Tactical innovation, experienced commanders, and daring maneuvers still influenced battles, but they no longer determined the war's direction. The conflict had expanded beyond the scale where individual decisions at the front could decide outcomes. Losses accumulated faster than victories could offset them. Entire armies could be destroyed and replaced. Fleets could be damaged and rebuilt. This shift did not announce itself clearly. Soldiers still fought, maps still moved, and headlines still focused on battles. Yet beneath these visible events, a deeper transformation was underway. The decisive arena of the war was slowly moving away from the battlefield and into factories, rail yards, ports, and supply networks. Nations that could replace losses quickly gained freedom to take risks. Nations that could not became increasingly cautious, then desperate. Strategy did not disappear, but it became constrained by production. Plans were only as viable as the industrial systems supporting them. Once this threshold was crossed, the war entered a phase where outcomes were shaped less by genius and more by capacity. It was not a dramatic transition. It was a quiet one. And once it occurred, it could not be reversed. Modern war consumes resources relentlessly. Every day of fighting destroys equipment, expends fuel, and wears down trained personnel. Ammunition must be replaced continuously. Vehicles break down as often as they are destroyed. Aircraft require constant maintenance and replacement. In this environment, victory belongs not to those who strike hardest once, but to those who can sustain effort over time. Industry provides that endurance. It determines whether losses are temporary setbacks or permanent damage. By the middle years of World War II, the scale of consumption exceeded anything previously experienced. Entire divisions could disappear in weeks. Air forces could lose hundreds of aircraft in days. Without the ability to replace these losses rapidly, even successful operations became meaningless. Industrial power allowed nations to absorb mistakes, learn, and continue fighting. It also allowed experimentation because failure was survivable. Countries lacking this capacity had no margin for error. Every loss reduced future options. Industry, therefore, did more than support the war. It defined the limits within which strategy could operate. Once those limits were reached, courage and innovation could not compensate. War ceased to reward brilliance alone. It rewarded sustainability. And sustainability is industrial. The United States demonstrated industrial mobilization on a scale never before seen. After entering the war, the American economy was rapidly reorganized around total war production. Civilian manufacturing was curtailed or redirected. Factories that once produced automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods were converted to produce tanks, aircraft, and engines. Shipyards expanded dramatically, launching vessels at unprecedented rates. The federal government coordinated production through centralized planning, prioritizing standardization and speed over refinement. Designs were simplified to allow mass production. Interchangeable parts reduced maintenance time and training requirements. This system did not aim for technical perfection. It aimed for volume and reliability. The results were overwhelming. By 1943, the United States was producing more military equipment than all Axis powers combined. Losses that would have crippled other nations were absorbed and replaced. This industrial surge reshaped strategy. American planners could assume that material superiority would compensate for tactical setbacks. The war became a contest. The United States was structurally equipped to win. Once this momentum was established, it could not be matched or neutralized. Industrial output became a strategic weapon in its own right. The Soviet Union faced industrial catastrophe in 1941, yet responded with one of the most extraordinary mobilization efforts in history. As German forces advanced, Soviet leadership ordered the relocation of thousands of factories eastward, beyond the reach of invasion. Entire industrial complexes were dismantled, transported by rail, and reassembled under extreme conditions. Workers labored with minimal shelter, food shortages, and relentless pressure. Production resumed before facilities were fully completed. This effort was chaotic and inefficient by peacetime standards, but effective in wartime terms. It preserved the core of Soviet industrial capacity at a critical moment. By 1942, output stabilized and then expanded rapidly. Simplified designs enabled mass production of tanks, artillery, and small arms. Quantity was prioritized over complexity. The Red Army absorbed enormous losses, yet replacements continued to arrive. This industrial resilience transformed the Eastern Front. Germany no longer faced an enemy that could be exhausted quickly. Once Soviet production reached sustainable levels, Germany's chance of winning a war of attrition disappeared. The battlefield reflected this shift slowly, but the outcome was already sealed by industry. Germany entered the war with a strong but constrained industrial base. Its economy was not fully mobilized for total war until late in the conflict. Production was fragmented across competing agencies, and political interference distorted priorities. Standardization lagged behind Allied efforts. Skilled labor shortages intensified as the war expanded. Germany also lacked secure access to critical raw materials, particularly oil. Attempts to increase output encountered structural limits that no administrative reform could overcome. Strategic bombing further strained capacity by disrupting transportation and forcing dispersion of factories. German engineers produced advanced weapons, but complexity reduced output and increased maintenance burdens. Innovation could not compensate for insufficient quantity. Each loss hurt more than it did for Germany's enemies. Over time, the gap widened. Germany did not experience sudden industrial collapse. It experienced cumulative disadvantage. Falling behind in an industrial war is indistinguishable from losing it. By the later stages of the conflict, Germany fought with shrinking reserves and declining flexibility. Industry did not fail dramatically. It simply could not keep pace. Japan faced even harsher industrial constraints than Germany. Its economy lacked scale, access to raw materials, and secure supply lines. Early expansion temporarily alleviated shortages, but transport vulnerabilities quickly undermined gains. Allied submarines disrupted shipping, isolating factories from fuel and resources. Aircraft and ship production expanded, but never at a rate sufficient to replace losses after 1942. Oil shortages limited training and operational effectiveness. Skilled pilots and sailors could not be replaced. Japan attempted to preserve quality by concentrating experience in elite units, but this strategy magnified losses when those units were destroyed. Industrial limitations shaped Japanese strategy toward defense far earlier than planned. Efforts to regain initiative failed because losses were permanent. The Pacific War became asymmetric. Every American loss was temporary. Every Japanese loss accumulated. No amount of courage or tactical ingenuity could reverse this imbalance. Industry dictated outcomes with increasing clarity. By the later years of the war, Japan fought not to win, but to delay. And delay only increased the cost of defeat. One of the most decisive but least visible advantages enjoyed by the Allies was standardization. Allied industries emphasized designs that could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and operated with minimal training. German and Japanese engineers often pursued technically superior systems requiring skilled labor and complex maintenance. In isolation, these designs were impressive. In war, they were liabilities. A reliable aircraft produced in thousands was more valuable than a superior one produced in dozens. Standardization allowed logistics, training, and maintenance to function as a single system. Interchangeable parts reduced downtime. Procedures were repeatable. Lessons learned could be applied across entire forces. The Axis powers struggled to achieve similar integration. Fragmentation undermined efficiency. As the war progressed, this difference widened. Industrial war rewarded repeatability, not elegance. Once that reality asserted itself, technological brilliance alone could not compensate for structural disadvantage. Industrial output only mattered if it could reach the front. Logistics evolved from a supporting function into a strategic centerpiece. The ability to move fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment across continents determined what operations were possible. The Allies invested heavily in logistics. Ports were expanded. Rail networks coordinated. Supply planning became systematic and centralized. Axis logistics deteriorated under pressure. Transport losses accumulated. Infrastructure collapsed faster than it could be repaired. Frontline units increasingly fought with shortages that limited mobility and effectiveness. Logistics lacks drama, but it determines endurance. Armies without supply cannot maneuver, regardless of courage. By the later stages of the war, Allied logistics enabled operations of unprecedented scale. Axis forces could not respond symmetrically. This imbalance was decisive. The war ceased to be about seizing ground and became about sustaining forts. As the industrial imbalance widened, individual battles gradually lost their power to decide the war's direction. Victories no longer shifted strategic trajectories, and defeats no longer guaranteed collapse. What mattered instead was cumulative pressure applied over time. Allied strategy adapted to this reality. Rather than seeking decisive engagements, planners focused on sustained operations designed to exhaust enemy capacity. Attrition favored the side with greater production and replacement ability. For the Axis, this shift was devastating. Their strategies required decisive outcomes that no longer existed. Battles were fought with intensity, but without realistic hope of altering the underlying balance. This phase of war is often misunderstood because it lacks dramatic turning points. Yet it is here that wars are truly decided. Industry ensured that time overwhelmingly favored one side. Once that balance was established, the end became a matter of process rather than possibility. The war continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. One of the most damaging factors for the Axis powers was delay in recognizing the industrial nature of the conflict. Early victories postponed difficult decisions. Leaders believed there would be time to adapt later. By the time adaptation began, it was already too late. Industrial systems require years to expand. They cannot be summoned instantly. The Allies benefited from earlier mobilization and greater capacity. The Axis paid for hesitation with irreversible disadvantage. Delay is never neutral in war. It compounds. Each month lost reduced future options. Once industrial momentum shifted, it could not be reclaimed quickly. This lesson extends beyond World War II. Modern conflicts punish hesitation in preparation more severely than errors in execution. The cost of delay is paid not in immediate defeat, but in lost flexibility. By the time that loss is understood, recovery is impossible. By the later stages of the war, the Axis powers were fighting without meaningful choice. Industrial inferiority removed strategic flexibility. Decisions became reactive. Options narrowed. The war continued, but agency diminished. This is the final stage of industrial war. When production curves diverge irreversibly, strategy becomes management of decline. Leaders continue issuing orders, but outcomes no longer respond to intent. The war advances under its own inertia. This stage is prolonged and destructive. Understanding it is essential to understanding how wars end. The absence of choice does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates, and once it is reached, it cannot be reversed. The war's conclusion becomes a question of endurance, not possibility. The Second World War is remembered for its battles, leaders, and atrocities. But its outcome was decided quietly, in factories, rail yards, and supply depots. Industry did not replace strategy. It overwhelmed it. Once the war became industrial, individual brilliance could no longer change its course. Capacity determined destiny. This is the central lesson of Episode 4. Wars do not end when armies fail. They end when systems can no longer sustain them. The industrial phase of the war ensured that outcome long before surrender documents were signed. History remembers the battles because they are visible. It forgets production curves because they are abstract. Yet, those curves decided the war. Understanding this explains why some conflicts feel decided long before they formally end. Control did not vanish on the battlefield. It vanished on the factory floor.